Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day, whatever. Just thought that I'd start reading slightly longer sections because this is a lockdown project and I'm thinking of going till, I think now we've had 19th of July put forward as the date on which all freedoms will be granted in the UK, it having been 21st of June, which was yesterday as I'm recording this. So that means if I read about 7 pages a day rather than the 2 or 3 I've been doing, we should get there and I'll now stop, finish the book and be done with it. And you won't be bored anymore, if indeed you've been watching at all, which you haven't. Well, not many people have. Anyway, so here we go. Heresy, heresy, heresy! Innocent III had originally condemned the attack on Constantinople, but then he realised that, with a Western Crusader on the throne of the Eastern Emperor, he had technically reunited the Church. Result. Admittedly, the Eastern Church saw things rather differently, but their city was in ruins, so nah. There is a marble relief plaque of Innocent III in the US House of Representatives, where he is one of 23 historical figures honoured for their work in establishing the principles that underlie American law. What? No, really, what? And if a crusade could solve that ancient problem, then maybe it could solve the other major issue facing Christendom, heresy. So, in 1209, Innocent launched a sequel, but this time the crusade was not against Christians in Greece, but in France, right at the heart of Europe. The Crusaders were to eliminate heresy in Languedoc, and as a reward they would get to keep the lands of any heretics they were willing to root out and destroy. The heretics in question had become known as the Cathari, although this is not what they called themselves. Like the word Christian itself, the name was actually applied to the movement by their enemies. Not many people called them Cathari at the time anyway. The term really became popular in the 19th century. The word Cathari comes from the Greek word for pure and may refer to their ascetic lifestyle. What actually seems to have happened is that the heresy hunters found a sect called the Cathari in an 8th century book on heresies and simply slapped that label on the radicals in the south of France. Aha! You thought the Cathari had died out 400 years ago, but here they are alive and well. Be afraid, be very afraid. In fact, very little is actually known about the beliefs of the Cathari. For centuries, based on the accusations of their inquisitors, it was assumed that they were dualists, a rebirth of Manichaeism. But that assumption has now been seriously questioned, and it appears increasingly likely that they were simply radical apostolic Christians. They encouraged their followers to avoid contact with corrupt priests. They seem to have had versions of the Bible in the vernacular, the Book of Acts at least. They demanded celibacy, including divorce for the married. They were vegans, not out of any concern for animal cruelty, but because all animal products were the result of fleshly congress. However, fish were okay since everyone knew that they were spontaneously created by water. They fasted 3 days a week. They banned all killing, possessions, and oath-taking. They allowed women priests because they believed that bodily differences were irrelevant. Very few could live up to these demands, so the Cathars, like the clerics in the early church, developed the idea of the perfect, those initiates who lived the full-on ascetic lifestyle, and the believers, lay people, who supported them. Whatever the reality, the Pope launched a war on heresy. He launched what became known as the Albigensian Crusade. The city of Albi was one of the centres of the cult. But how do you wage war on heresy? Well, you need experts. You need heresy hunters, theological intelligence operatives. You need Dominic. Fact file on Dominic. Name Domingo Felix de Guzman, aka Dominic, nationality Spanish. Dates 1170 to 1221. Appearance medium height, apparently with strawberry blonde hair and beard and long hands. I don't know why, but I always imagined him with very sharp cheekbones. He was that sort of guy. Before he was famous, a monk. Famous for founding the Dominicans, aka the Blackfriars. Hunting heretics, inadvertently inspiring the Inquisition. Why does he matter? The order he founded, the Dominicans, became the primary teaching order of the Church. They also became its secret police and intelligence officers. Could you have a drink with him down the pub? Possibly, but you would have to be very, very careful what you said. Helping with inquiries. Dominic was a Spanish priest from an Augustinian monastery who was recruited by the Church to beef up the campaign against the heretics in the south of France. Dominic realised that if the campaign against heresy was going to succeed, it could not be seen to be waged by rich, comfortable, powerful people, These were exactly the kinds of people the heretics were rebelling against. You don't win a campaign on corruption by sending a load of corrupt priests to order everyone about. He decided to beat the heretics at their own game. If they lived among the poor, he would live among the poor. And not just he alone. He formed a whole band of preachers who lived a simple life, travelling from town to town and teaching people the truth. They had to know their stuff, so Dominic made sure that they were carefully educated and that they were good at teaching others. His efforts in the south of France didn't quite go to plan, not least because there were too many people involved in the conflict who preferred old-fashioned brutality to his newfangled intellectualism. But his basic idea of a teaching order of monks caught on rapidly, and they became known as the Dominicans. Dominic's passion, the mission that drove him, was evangelistic. He was trying to win the Cathars back to what he saw as orthodoxy. But the effect was that the Dominicans became the secret police of the church. From heresy hunting in the south of France, they moved into the universities, where they started combating radical ideas put about by academics. The Dominicans gained a reputation for having enormous brains, but their intelligence was used as a weapon. They were intellectual warriors fighting against heresy. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX took heresy hunting to a new level with the establishment of the Inquisition. Nobody, of course, was expecting it, and he put the Dominicans in charge. The idea was to have an organization dedicated to rooting out heresy, trying the culprits, and having them executed. Obviously, the church couldn't do the actual execution stuff. That would have been wrong. So they just did the investigating, and then handed the condemned over to the state to do the actual dispatching. The Inquisition relied on third-party accusations against heretics. The accused were then tried in secret, without any legal representation, of course. If they confessed, they could often be let off with a penance, and losing all their property. But if they protested their innocence, they were tortured until they confessed. Torture was officially sanctioned by Rome in 1252. If they still managed to hold out, they were burnt. Heads, I win. Tails, you are burnt to a crisp. So, fact file on Francis. Name Giovanni Bernardone, aka Francis, or Frenchy of Assisi. Nationality Italian. Dates 1181-82 to 1226. Appearance shortish, round face, dark hair and black beard. Apparently his ears were small and upright. Thin lips, good teeth, and he had thin legs and small feet. Before he was famous, a young, wealthy playboy. Famous for founding the Franciscans, the Women's Order of St. Clair, and the Third Order of St. Francis for laymen and women. Writing poetry, exhibiting stigmata. Why does he matter? He lived a life of commitment to the poor. The Franciscans, or Friars Minor, became one of the main preaching orders of the church. Francis was a living reminder that Christ lived a life of poverty. Could you have a drink with him down the pub? I think so. Might have to be organic, even vegan. He was into that sort of thing. San Francisco. Much of the heresy that the Inquisition had to be set up to root out arose from one simple fact, that laymen were often more devout than their clergy. Giovanni Bernardone was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant in Assisi, a flourishing town in central Italy. His father liked to call him Francesco, which is more fashionably French. In fact, it means French. Anyway, young Frenchy joined the family firm and enjoyed the benefits of wealth, fine clothes, fast horses, and a taste for marzipan. But Francesco grew dissatisfied. He wanted to drop out. But in 13th century Italy, there was nowhere for him to drop out to. Punk hadn't been invented. You could go to art college in the form of an apprenticeship, but unlike modern art schools, you actually had to be able to paint. One day, the story goes, he saw a leper in the road. He got off his high horse and embraced the man. Then he had a vision in the church of San Damiano in Italy, where a talking crucifix told him to go repair my falling house. So he spent a lot of money rebuilding the local church, which had fallen to ruins. The only problem was that he had borrowed the money from his father. That's borrow as in take without asking. Then, 2 years later, he had a Waldensian-style conversion. He heard the story in the Bible of Jesus sending out his disciples and decided that he would do the same. From then on, he was committed to a life of radical poverty and service. He called himself Brother Francis, or as we know him, Francis of Assisi. From the start, he was a get-your-hands-dirty sort of guy. Get your hands infected, probably, since he and his followers worked alongside the peasants and the lepers and the outcasts. Pope Innocent was deeply suspicious of this movement. There was only a fag paper thin difference between the Franciscans and the Waldensians, and the latter were definitely heretics. It said so in his law books. But the movement was incredibly popular. And anyway, Innocent had a dream in which he saw Francis holding up a decaying and crumbling church. So he gave the order official recognition, and they became known as the Lesser Brothers or Friars Minor. It was a humble term for a humble community. Francis's story has certainly been mythologized, but there is a core of genuine radical goodness. He gathered together a load of followers who were prepared to give up their possessions and become nobodies in order to serve the great somebody. Francis was essentially an anarchist. He levelled out the medieval hierarchy that had man at the top of creation. In his famous poem, The Canticle of the Sun, Francis talks about Brother Sun and Sister Moon moving through a world of wind, water, creatures, fire, plants, and earth. Humanity didn't appear until a later version. He genuinely hated power. He didn't want to be a leader, yet many people were drawn to his example. And without ever wanting to, he became the leader of a group known as the Franciscans. As soon as he could, though, he handed the leadership over to someone else. It left him free to pray. He was the first known person to get stigmata, bleeding from the 5 points where Jesus was pierced on the cross. Francis spent the last years of his life trying to keep the movement he had reluctantly founded true to his ideals. Just before he died, he expressed concerns that his commitment to poverty would not be carried on with such zeal by his followers, and he worried about the fact that they were spending money building enormous convents. He died in 1226, and within a decade his followers had built a vast, magnificent church over his tomb. Indeed, the Pope came and laid the foundation stone. It was exactly the kind of monument he would have hated. And the movement fragmented. It split into the conventuals and the spirituals. The conventuals were those who wanted to make the order more like the Dominicans. The spirituals were those who wanted to stick to Francis's ideals of poverty, simplicity, and getting away from everyone. Some of the spirituals took things to extremes and started preaching the destruction of all authority. And authority was not having any of that. Eventually, surprise, surprise, the spirituals were condemned as heretical by Pope John XXII. In 1323, he had 4 of them burned at the stake for the appalling heresy of preaching that Christ had lived in absolute poverty. I mean, as if. The bulk of the Franciscans, though, carried on in a more moderate vein. Like the Dominicans, they became involved in the universities. Like the Dominicans, they built monastic communities where the people were. They wanted to interact with ordinary people. Their churches were designed so that people could come in and hear the sermons. Their refectories were open to people from the streets to come in and talk to them. Unlike a lot of the monastic communities, they wanted people to come in, to browse, as it were. And typically, the two houses, Franciscan and Dominicans, became bitter rivals. They were so alike, it was inevitable that they should end up hating one another.